Hello, welcome back to the Eau Rouge podcast. We've had a little bit of a break between some car launches, and now we're back for Ferrari. Obviously, we weren't expecting too much difference in terms of the livery for this one, but there have been some quite significant changes to the car, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I would just like to point out the little bit of lime green on the new Ferrari. What do you make of that, Chris?
I hate it.
Me too.
I'll be honest. Why is there green on a Ferrari? What are they doing with green on a Ferrari? What's the point of it?
It's not like it's a subtle green either. It's, you could probably see that a mile off. It just, I know I'm always going on about how I want cars to stand out on the grid and I want them to look colorful, but I do want those color schemes to also match. I want them to look good together. And even though it's just a little splash of lime green on the car, it's hideous, isn't it? It really just, it takes everything away from the scarlet red of the Ferrari that we've known.
Yeah. And the thing with Ferrari is you can't really mess with it. Put some white on it if you want, maybe some black. Why? What purpose does it serve to put green on the side of a Ferrari?
Well, let's talk. Let's move on from that hideous, thing that we're looking at, and let's actually talk about the significant changes to the car, because there has been quite a few. It looks like there's been some lots of changes to the rear end, obviously the engine, a new nose and front wing. Is there anything in there, Chris, that you're specifically interested in, or you think that's going to make a really big difference to the car this year?
What the car really needs is that engine to work. I assume a lot of the repackaging at the back is to do with the new airflow rules, probably partially to accommodate whatever it is they've done to the engine. The new aero on the front looks quite striking. I think it's a very unique looking car, actually. And I apart from the green, I think it looks nice. Short and squat, but I love that era of super wide front wings with the tiny rear wings and the way the cars look then. And I feel in a way this is an update of that look. And I do really appreciate it. I can see why they're trying to sort out front wing downforce, because they had some real issues with it last year. And the engine work as well is Ferrari's biggest failing, is how terrible that engine was. So putting in the work to fix it, I think, is what we expected Ferrari to do with the off season.
And Ferrari have got to improve, haven't they? I mean, this is going to be our main talking point today about Ferrari, the most historic team in Formula One. They had an embarrassing season last year. It all fell apart, didn't it? And after many years, really, of them not being successful in terms of world championships. They've obviously won a fair amount of races over the last 10 years or whatever since their last world champion, Kimi Räikkönen. But they've always been the nearly men. They've been just there or thereabouts, sort of second to Red Bull or second to Mercedes. And they've always been threatening to challenge, but they never really, I don't think, have really launched a true challenge. Maybe in the early days of this decade, of the last decade with Red Bull. But other than that, they haven't really done much. But now they've fallen off a cliff. And I mean, I don't really know what happened. But they've got to do so much better this year, or, well, there's going to be a lot of peoples with their heads on the chopping blocks.
Yeah, there is. Ferrari's greatest trick, really, is convincing everyone they're a hugely successful team. Because if you take a real look at the stats, with the exception of the first 7 years of the 2000s, they're actually not that. They won nothing between 79 and 2000. They've won nothing since 2007. They had 3 titles in the 70s, 2 in the 60s, 4 in the 50s. Their huge haul and their history comes from the fact they've been there since the start. Ferrari have these periods of ultra competitiveness, but it's often because they use their mystique to get the best drivers, I think, not necessarily because since the introduction of aerodynamics, since there was anything technologically groundbreaking about the Ferrari, which I think is a controversial opinion, but that is what I'm here for.
Indeed it is. But no, I do agree to an extent, because there were lots of rumours bandied around for the last couple of years with Lewis Hamilton and his potential desire to go to Ferrari. Obviously, he's had a few contracts, talks going on over the last few years, which has spiked those rumours. And the whole time you're just thinking, why on earth would he leave Mercedes to go anywhere? But why on earth would he leave Mercedes? And again, like you said, it's that mystique of Ferrari, that draw that they seem to have just simply by being the most historic team, when really their success without Michael Schumacher and that period of success, again, the success wasn't just down to Schumacher. It was the Ferrari team. They had Ross Brawn and Jean Todt, who I think were tactically, very astute. If you look at a lot of the races back then, they really did win their races through their tactical ability when they're under pressure. But really, other than that, they haven't been that successful. And yet there is this idea that they are the big team. They could draw anyone. They are able to take Carlos Sainz away from a better car, I would say. They're able to attract these drivers that maybe and other teams would be able to, just simply because of their mystique. But then again, I do think also F1 is not F1 without Ferrari. So if we were to lose them, if they were to drop off by too much, we would see a seismic shift in Formula One like no other.
Oh yeah, no. Ferrari are Formula One, and Formula One is Ferrari. The two are very closely linked. But I think that the reason Ferrari have a lot of sway for younger drivers is because they remember the momentous Schumacher years. I think it's interesting to look at the fact that Senna would have driven a Williams for free, but wasn't interested in a Ferrari seat. Was he the best driver of the late 80s, early 90s? Probably. Were Ferrari very good? No. But that mystique wasn't enough to pull him there. Likewise, I'd be really interested to see when Hamilton retires and if Mercedes stay in the sport, whether young drivers want to go to recreate the career of Hamilton the way that people, Vettel, for example, wanted to go to Ferrari to recreate the career of Schumacher. And I wonder how much of it is what you grow up with, what you grow up seeing, what you grow up watching past that checkered flag, who stands on the top step of the podium. And I mean, I know for you and I, it was really getting into Formula One in the Hakkinen years, which has given us both, I think, a permanent soft spot for McLaren. And I suppose being a Hakkinen fan, a mistrust perhaps of Ferrari on some level. But I think that's what it is. I think you've got a generation of drivers now who grew up watching that incredible 5-year streak from 2000 to 2000, arguably even I suppose from about 1997 till 2004. And they want to be the next chapter in that story.
It's a really interesting thing to think about when it comes to attracting young drivers, because I think you're right there, that obviously has an impact. And also, of course, remember that a lot of these young drivers know the Schumacher family as well. It's not just like they watched it on the TV like we did. They were there with them, they were sat alongside their peers, were all involved in this, dynasty that started with Schumacher. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that Ferrari era sort of began from 96, 97 when Schumacher joined. It seemed that they had the time to build there. And it seemed very obvious at the time that Schumacher joining was going to spark this level of competitiveness that they'd not seen for many years. And there was a process there. There was this idea that we will get there. We're recruiting the best people. We've got the best driver. We've just got to build it up. And they had that time. Now I think the Ferrari tried a similar thing, and whether the recruitment was wrong or right, or they're sure they made a lot of mistakes along the way. But now I feel like people are impatient. Now I feel like I feel impatient. I was ready for a challenge for the last couple of years from Ferrari to Mercedes, and it's not happened. And so that challenge is what's needed. But they're running out of time, aren't they?
Yes, I think taking it back again, because the recent glory of Ferrari is really inextricably linked with Michael Schumacher. I think that the reason that Ferrari succeeded was because it was the one team not dominated by a personality. McLaren, you had to play it Ron Dennis's way. Williams, you had to play it Frank Williams' way. And I think Ferrari had the space back then to bide their time and build a winning team. A winning team which was destroyed by the same thing that costs Ferrari now, which is internal politics and tension that keeps ripping the team apart. And what this is ultimately, I think, what keeps Ferrari from succeeding is rule changes. It's bizarre rumours that Mattia Binotto has been sacked coming from a Czech customer driver. Like, there is very little cohesion at Ferrari, which is what ultimately affects them. Sebastian Vettel is an outstanding driver who had some outstanding years at Ferrari, as did Fernando Alonso. And two of the greatest drivers in the modern sport could not manage to drag that Ferrari to a title. And I think it says a lot about the state of the team.
Well, you mentioned Binotto there. That was the next thing I was going to bring us on to, the bizarre rumors that came out over the weekend. Now, if you've not heard about this, there were lots of rumors over the weekend that Binotto had been sacked at a really strange time, the weekend before their car was going to be released. And it all seemed to, like you said, stem from this one person who seemed to have an inside knowledge, but nothing has materialized. Where did it come from, and how bizarre was that?
Well, it came from a GT driver called Joseph Kral, who describes himself as a Ferrari GT driver, but he's actually just a driver at a Ferrari customer team. He now says that some of his recent comments about Ferrari have been misinterpreted and taken out of context. What I said was based on my own opinion without any real base of information. I apologize if these speculations have created any issues. And for sure, it's interesting to see that Binotto doesn't attend races anymore, really. But I think that's because Ferrari is trying to restructure in a useful, creative way rather than because Binotto has done terribly. And to be sure, if Ferrari have another year like 2020, I think Joseph Kral will just turn out to have been prescient rather than incorrect. But will Ferrari have another year as disastrous as 2020? I hope not.
Well, it's hard. It's because when we were talking about the rumors that were coming out about Binotto potentially being sacked, we were of the mind of that. Well, if he's been sacked now, that must mean the car is awful. Why else would you sack someone at that particular time? But now we know these rumors were just rumors, and that there's no basis behind it. But are they, with Binotto not turning up to so many races and the restructuring going on, are they trying to take him out of the firing line a little bit, or are they saying you're taking a back seat now because you've not done good enough?
I think really Binotto's strength is as an engineer, is what he did for Ferrari, is how he rose to prominence within Ferrari. So I think putting him in an engineering context is probably better because he's not really made any banging strategy calls, has he? Ferrari's strategy has become somewhat of a punchline. So I think putting him where he does best is probably good. And I obviously can't speak to his ability as a man manager at the team, but I'm assuming if they've given him this chance to do what he does best, he's probably not bad at man management. And therefore, they're trying to maximize putting him in the place he needs to be in order to succeed, rather than sort of putting him on gardening leave, because I don't know who you'd get at this point. Internal promotions just haven't worked. They've absolutely shot through team principals. Since Todt left in 2007, which is only 14 years ago, they've had 4 team principals, with three in the space of a year: Domenicali, Mattiacci, and Arriva Bene between 2014 and 2015. And that sort of turbulence is really not good for the sport in the slightest.
So let's move on to talk about the drivers then. We talked a lot about the team. There's a lot to discuss with Ferrari. I think that they are going to be one of the most interesting packages to watch this season, and partly contributing to that, I think, will be the new boy, Carlos Sainz, left McLaren to join Ferrari. Has he left a team with a better car? Oh, this links back to what we were saying earlier about the draw and the mystique of Ferrari. Again, it's obviously really difficult to tell in the early days before you actually get to see the cars race or do anything. But has he left a team that is clearly on the up to go to a team that might be on the way down?
it's a gamble, isn't it? The thing is, if Ferrari can get it right, it's the right move to make. You forever get associated with Ferrari. It will always. These days, it's rarely McLaren driver. It's always former Ferrari driver Fernando Alonso, former Ferrari driver Sebastian Vettel, former Ferrari driver Michael Schumacher, former Ferrari driver Kimi Raikkonen. That's the thing that sticks with you when you drive for them. So, yeah, I do fancy McLaren to do better than Ferrari this year. I think we've discussed that already, but I don't know if that is enough given the magic of Ferrari and being that Ferrari driver to cause him to make the right decision, in inverted commas.
So let's talk about then Ferrari and their choice to actually hire Sainz, because there was a lot of options for them, it seemed, at the time. And obviously any driver that was going to get picked, as we say, the calling of Ferrari rarely gets ignored. They were all probably going to say yes. But is what Ferrari have done, have gone from a 4-time world champion to a driver with a career best second place finish. So is this also a gamble for Ferrari?
Yeah, it wasn't working out with Vettel. So I think getting rid of Vettel probably was the right decision. Although was telling me he was sacked a year before his contract was up the right move? Probably not. That seems like some more Ferrari internal politics to me. What Ferrari always want is a clear number one and a supporting driver. It's always been the way that Ferrari has worked. I don't know if you can tell that they were around about the same time as Mussolini, but I should think the strong leader and the obedient follower might give that away. You see it in Massa, you see it in Barrichello, you saw it in Irvine. What you really have is somebody who is there to make sure the other person wins. Sainz is a good enough driver to be covering Leclerc in the unlikely event that Leclerc finds himself in the lead. But he's, at least I suspect in Ferrari's eyes, unlikely to upset the apple cart. And that, I think, is the attraction. It's what Red Bull are constantly looking for. And I believe they found in Perez. A driver good enough to be where they need to be, but not so good they're going to upset the team leader.
Ironically, they had Sainz on their books, of course, who could have been the perfect number 2 for them, but wasn't to be. But I think that's interesting about Sainz in terms of his, because he is quite consistent, isn't he? He's a consistent driver. He's been in a car that has been a midfield team for a while now, and has been driving it to its full potential, you would certainly say. So his consistency could prolong his stay at Ferrari. Although I don't really see this is the closest between teammates in Ferrari that maybe we've seen for quite some time. So the partnerships that you mentioned there, Schumacher and Irvine, the quality difference between Schumacher and Irvine was obvious. Schumacher was a far better driver than Irvine. Even Irvine himself admitted that. Barrichello, not as good as Schumacher, obviously. Barrichello, even though there were times where he definitely, he could have won a few more races if he hadn't moved over and let Schumacher through, but he was obviously not as good as Michael Schumacher. And then again, the idea was that when Vettel was in the team, he was the experienced one, and Leclerc was new and would not be as good as Vettel. And so I think this is the closest partnership that we've seen probably since maybe Alonso Massa, and even then, you could argue that the performance gap or the ability gap between Alonso and Massa was quite big as well. So it's interesting that maybe they've not quite gone for the traditional number one and number 2 driver in that sense. I think we might see it switch around a little bit more. But will Sainz's consistency actually keep him at the team, or is this a stopgap for Ferrari until they wait for Mick Schumacher to blossom into the driver that they all want him to be?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I'd be feeling uncomfortable with Mick Schumacher because I think Schumacher's there to do what Leclerc did. And I think Leclerc was placed in Alfa Romeo to test him out, did really well. And the undoing was they wanted to make room for him as the future of the team, which couldn't do with a 4-time world champion. I think this is the closest closest partnership in terms of skill, actually, since Berger and Alesi in the mid-90s.
Wow.
That, to me, seems like the last time you had two drivers who were so close together. Because I don't know if I think that Leclerc is quite as good as people say. I think he had a storming first year and got put in a great car. I'd like to see him work for a title, which again, I know, controversial opinion, but I don't know how, if you took him out of that Ferrari and put him in the AlphaTauri, consistently great you'd see him be in the pack now. It's an interesting question. And I assume one we'll see this year. I would expect Leclerc to finish ahead of Sainz, but maybe only by a place and maybe only by a handful of points.
Well, let's talk about Leclerc then. So he's now the lead driver at Ferrari, probably for many years to come, considering how young he is. But there's two questions about that, I think, about Charles Leclerc. Firstly, can he handle that pressure? I think he's shown over the last 2 years that he can handle that Ferrari lead driver's role. He can. The mantle was passed down to him by Vettel, or he forcibly took it. Either way, he has it. So I think, to me, that he's proved he can handle it. Obviously, he's not necessarily been a world championship contender, so that's a whole different kettle of fish. But to be the lead driver for Ferrari, I think he's got that maturity there by the looks of things. He'll make some mistakes, but he seems to be able to handle the pressure. But it is a question that we'll see the answer to. But I do think he's got the potential to go two ways. I think he's got the potential to be the next Schumacher, as close as Ferrari feel that he can get to it. I'm not saying he's going to be 7-time world champion, but just to win one with Ferrari. Or he's got the potential to be like Vettel, where there's so much promise and so much expectation, only for him to fall flat and then for him to leave. Do you have an opinion on which way you think he'll go?
Not yet. I'm holding on to it. I made some hasty comments about Ferrari at the start of this podcast, and implied that they weren't as good as people said they were because they didn't have many drivers' world champions. So what I'd like to do is edit that statement slightly in light of recent information that I've received. Ferrari, with a couple of bad years excluded, always there or thereabouts. With the exception of last year, they have not finished lower than fourth since 1982. Ferrari are a platform for drivers to prove themselves. It's just that only the best of the best tend to prove themselves in a Ferrari. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to see here. Are these two guys, particularly Charles Leclerc, the best of the best? Or did they have individually great moments that they can't string together into something more defined?
I think that I really want to believe that Leclerc is going to have this great future, because I think we've got a lot of drivers that we're expecting to be challenging. And I think for the first time in a long time, we could have more than one or two people challenging for the world title. Because if every year now we talk about Hamilton's going to win, Bottas needs to do better to challenge, Verstappen's good enough, he's just not in as good a car. It's always them three that are mentioned in the same sentence, but they've never really contested. It's always been Lewis Hamilton right there at the front.
It's going to be Lewis Hamilton right there at the front again.
And it will be this season.
I'm going to shoot this down.
No, but once Hamilton leaves, I'm talking about a few years down the line now. I'm not talking about right now. But a few years down the line, if Ferrari can build a decent car again, we could have Russell in the Mercedes challenging for the world title alongside Max Verstappen in the Red Bull and Leclerc in the Ferrari. I think that would be an incredible three-way tussle for the world championship.
It's a salivating prospect, isn't it? The thought of a really close three-way battle. Anyone could take it. That sort of thing that hasn't happened really since 2010. But then again, I think things always seem rosier when you look into the future, and we are dependent on Ferrari being internally cohesive enough to allow that to happen. Or I suppose one of the drivers leaving, Leclerc moving into a vacant Hamilton seat, for example.
Yeah, any car, I suppose that could be. And I would imagine that Ferrari would rebuild over the next couple of years, I suppose, which they do have a habit of doing. And when they have periods of, not so great results, they do tend to get back on the horse eventually. Yeah, and like you said, that would be an incredible prospect. That's my hope for the future in this decade, this upcoming decade, is that we're going to have that three-way battle, and then any other drivers who potentially are up there as well could join. And you're right, we've not had that for a long time. We've not had that since the kind of Webber, Vettel, Alonso days. Before that, I think in the 2003 season, in the last race, I think that Schumacher, Raikkonen, and Montoya all had the ability to win the World Championship. Or certainly in the last few races, they were all still in it until, of course, Schumacher ultimately took it. So that's what we're looking for from Leclerc in the future. I want him to be challenging for titles. I do think that eventually he will be good enough. But again, if Ferrari don't improve their car, maybe they could lose that pull of recruiting those star drivers potentially.
They need to start turning it around. I think realistically, they haven't won a drivers' championship since 2007, and they only won the constructors' championship in 2008 because McLaren were disqualified. I think that they are in danger of falling back. Between 2010 and 2019, they finished third, second, fourth, second, third, second. So they were a good ride, but was that good ride because they had three of the four greatest drivers of the era in Vettel, Raikkonen, and Alonso? Is it because they're a genuinely good car? I would disagree with some of those years on that one. Or is it something else? And if they don't recover from that sixth last year, they do genuinely risk falling away again, as they did in the 90s. They came fourth in 92, fourth in 93, third in 94 and 95. So I think this Schumacher revitalized the dying Ferrari myth is slightly edited to make Schumacher's accomplishment look great. Obviously, what he went on to do, something else entirely. But Ferrari were never quite as terrible as people said, with the exception of 1980 and 1981.
So let's talk about our predictions then for Ferrari this season. They finished sixth last year with just 131 points. I think that was their worst finish since 1980 is what I've got written down here. Maybe early 80s, certainly. It's been 40 years since they really had such a terrible season. Leclerc came eighth with 98 points, which I think actually is a decent haul considering how terrible the Ferrari was that season. And Sainz came sixth last year in the McLaren, of course, with 105 points. So only finished 7 points ahead of Leclerc in a significantly better car. So where do we think Ferrari are going to finish this year?
Ferrari themselves, fifth. That is an improvement. How much of an improvement are we going to see in the face of a better McLaren? And the Aston Martin question again, are Aston Martin going to bring it home this year or not? So I've got them down for fifth because I've said, yes, Aston Martin are going to bring it home this year. But it could be one place either way. Ferrari could have a poor year again and finish behind AlphaTauri, although I do doubt that. I think AlphaTauri's great finish last season was augmented by what happened at Monza. I have Leclerc in ninth, and I have Sainz in 12th.
So you think Sainz will finish outside the top 10?
Not through necessarily any fault of his own, but if you look at who's above him, Hamilton, Bottas, Verstappen, Perez, Gibbons, Vettel and Ricciardo, you have to think they'll finish above the Ferraris. Norris in a better car, you'd see him finishing. You'd expect Norris to finish ahead of Sainz. I think it was on a knife edge last year, and Norris almost certainly has the better car this year. Leclerc, you would anticipate being ahead of Gasly. Sorry, Leclerc, you'd anticipate being ahead of Sainz. Gasly into 10th because I think he's got something to prove. The big question mark is Fernando Alonso, who I have in 11th. Depending on that Alpine package and the sort of year, does Alonso have a really good Alonso year or a really terrible Alonso year? You can never tell. But I've got him down to have a relatively decent Alonso year and finish slightly ahead of Sainz. So 9th and 12th for the drivers, 5th for Ferrari overall.
Yeah, so I've gone with Ferrari in 5th as well. Just basing it on last year's car, I'm not sure they can make such great strides this year to beat the likes of Aston Martin and McLaren, certainly not Red Bull and Mercedes. So I've got them down in 5th. They are a better team than AlphaTauri and Alfa Romeo, Williams, Haas. Obviously, with Alpine as well, you would expect them to be slightly better as well. The difference in our predictions here is I've also gone for Leclerc to finish in 9th, but I've gone for Sainz to finish in 10th to round off that top 10. And you and I have actually got Gasly and Sainz the opposite way round. So I've got Sainz in 10th, Alonso 11th, and Gasly 12th. So I think that they will just round off that top 10. I don't think they're going to be as bad as last season. I think Sainz is a good driver. I think that he is consistent. And if the Ferrari can be consistent, then so will he be. And he'll be closer to Leclerc than maybe we think. Like I said earlier, I'm not sure that 1 and 2 driver gap is actually that big this season. So yeah, Ferrari in 5th, Leclerc 9th, and Sainz 10th. In upcoming podcasts, we will post our full predictions that we've done for everybody to see, from the table from 1st to 20th and the constructors from 1st to 10th. But for today, we're just talking about Ferrari. So coming up in the future, in Formula One and also in the Eau Rouge podcast, we'll be doing a little podcast once preseason testing is finished. That's starting up this weekend, so we actually get to see the cars in action over the weekend. It will be very, very exciting to see them back on track for the first time since last year. And then also, of course, we've got the Drive to Survive series. That's third series coming out later on next week, which we will, I'm sure, mention as well. As for this podcast, thank you so much for listening. We really hope you've enjoyed all of our podcasts over the launches over the last couple of weeks. We've really enjoyed doing it. It's been really interesting looking at the new cars and actually being able to talk about it and broadcast our thoughts across YouTube for all of you who are listening at the moment. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Please do like the video, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and leave a comment. We would love to get you involved in our podcast. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again later on next week.